Hello, Bill.
Good morning, Matt.
Good to talk to you. Welcome to the DMZ, everybody.
I thought in the middle of the week that it would be a very happy DMZ because the left wanted to take out Chris Christie and the right wanted to take out Chris Christie after Bridgegate flared up. But I sense perhaps that the right is starting to rally behind Christie after he took out a few staffers.
Well, look, I think you got a couple things going on. There is this tendency on the right. Maybe it's universal. I don't know, but to sort of defend the indefensible when the enemy is worse, when the enemy is Barack Obama. I actually think Chris Christie gave a really, it was a horrible scandal, obviously, but I think Christie gave a pretty darn good response. And I don't see conservatives rushing to defend him, per se, jumping on the bandwagon of defending him. But I do see a lot of stuff like, well, at least Chris Christie fired people. Barack Obama doesn't fire anybody. Nobody, talk about Benghazi or IRS. So I think you do see that sort of, there's points being scored on the conservative Twitter sphere. But I would disagree with you. I do not think that conservatives are really rallying to Christie's defense here.
So you think this is kind of a Trent Lott situation where, 10 years, 11 years ago, Trent Lott praises Strom Thurmond's segregationist presidential campaign at his birthday party, and the right just piles on Trent Lott, joins with the left because they want, ostensibly because they want to remove racism from the party, but underlying that is really, we don't want Trent Lott as majority leader because we think he's kind of a squish, and here's our chance to take him out. Do you think that kind of dynamic is at play here?
No, I don't think it's to that degree. And I would add another component to the Trent Lott thing. It wasn't just conservatives having no love for Lott, but it was also like the Bush White House and the establishment trying to put Bill Frist, their guy, in that position as well. So he really had not a lot of allies on the Republican side. I think
Christie has, I guess, a degree of establishment support, but it's not universal. I mean, we can argue it's kind of regional, and not a lot of allies in the conservative movement and on Capitol Hill.
Right.
So he does seem to be kind of fighting his own battle here.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think the Trent Lott comparison sort of apples and oranges, except in the sense that, I mean, Christie has not endeared himself to a lot of Republicans and conservatives. I mean, he didn't come to Virginia to campaign for Ken Cuccinelli. He attacks John Boehner and House Republicans when they don't do what he thinks they ought to do for New Jersey. He threw Mitt Romney under the bus like 2 weeks before Election Day, less than 2 weeks before Election Day, after endorsing Romney and sort of helping foist him on the rest of us. And so I think
but also kind of
people,
self-aggrandizing speech at the convention itself. There kind of was this narrative of Christie, I think an insider narrative, that it's always about Christie and never about helping anybody else.
Yeah.
And this scandal seems to both fit into that narrative, and that the lengths they will go to bolster his bipartisan cred, that they would try to take out a Democratic mayor wouldn't play ball, and also show that he doesn't build up the kind of relationships that help him get through a tough time like this. Even when, there's a plausible argument to make that he didn't know. I mean, there is no evidence that he knew directly. I mean, I would think that, even if I don't really believe that, if I was a Christie partisan, I would say that, and I would keep saying it until it was proved otherwise. But no one seems to be driving that message really hard right now.
Right. Well, look, I think a few things. One, I think Christie, you talk about the self-aggrandizement. I mean, that was the one. There were a couple of problems with the press conference he gave. Generally, I think it was very good, and I think he helped himself. But he did seem to be more angry at his staffers for lying to him than for closing down the lanes to the bridge.
Wasn't it weird that he's in the middle of the press conference, he says, "I'm not some kind of poll-tested, blow-dried candidate or governor.
Yeah.
I mean, he's branding himself in the middle of scandal management. It's weird.
Well, there were some Freudian slips, and that's sort of what happens when you go on ad nauseum. I mean, this thing lasted hours, and I think that's the plus side of having a press conference that doesn't end is you sort of exhaust the questions, you get everything out, you don't allow anybody to say that you're ducking questions. The downside is eventually you will trip up, and he said things like that. He talked, mistakes were made. I'm not a bully, another sort of Nixonian, I'm not a crook thing. So, I mean, the fact that this press conference sort of dragged on and on and on did have a downside. Maybe the upside outweighs it. But look, I would also say you're right. He hasn't nationally, he has not built up a lot of goodwill from Republicans and conservatives. I don't think they're trying to take him down, but I don't think they're going to rush to his defense or expend a lot of capital to save him. Having said that, I do think he's built up a lot of goodwill in New Jersey before this, and I do think he has tremendous rhetorical abilities, and he's a very good communicator. So I wouldn't write him off. I don't think this is the end of him. I think it's very possible. Now, if it comes out, if there's a smoking gun that proves that he knew about this and or ordered it, that's a game changer. To be cliched, but otherwise, I think he could absolutely survive this.
Sure. I mean, people have survived lots of things. I wouldn't say that that's untrue, but it does seem like his argument for the nomination, his argument to the conservative base is primarily an electability argument. I can win in blue areas. I can get Democratic support, and I can get some conservative things. This is for me a little more policy oriented than electability, but I can get conservative things done in blue areas, but it's not so much. I created X number of jobs in New Jersey. I got the unemployment rate down in New Jersey. I feel it's not so much of a policy-oriented argument. And this was kind of Hillary Clinton's problem in 2008. It was primarily I'm the most qualified and electable, and then she does something along the way that undermines her electability. I mean, electability is kind of a very flimsy premise. Because any mistake you make then says maybe you're not so electable anymore.
Right.
And I feel like Christie's sort of in that jam now that, Willie Brown, one of my favorite political quotes, Willie Brown was the mayor of San Francisco and kind of built up a roguish, lovable rogue persona. He was on Bill Maher's Ultra Politically Incorrect, and he once said, I lie, I cheat, and I steal. So Bill Maher said, sort of only in San Francisco. But that to me was sort of I don't think it's just an only in San Francisco thing. I think there are a lot of examples of people who voters bond with, not just in spite of, but perhaps because of their rough edges.
Right.
If they're seen as particularly competent. You don't necessarily embrace a scandal-prone, incompetent executive. Well,
I wouldn't even, no, I might even disagree there. I think that Marion Barry is beloved in the District of Columbia to this day.
Well, I was there. I lived in D.C. in 1995 and 96, I forget the exact year, when that blizzard hit. And the plows did not come. That was the end of the deep Barry love throughout the city. I think before then, he got back in office, I think based on, we're going to rally around our guy. But once he stopped being seen as a competent mayor, then that went away. He didn't run for office again after that. For mayor after that. He's now a city council.
Yeah. But he does still go by, the last I checked, he goes by Councilman Mayor Barry. So he still has the title.
He is mayor for
look,
life.
I think a couple things. I know that. So Christie, you may not see this, Bill, because I know you don't like him, but Christie does have that sort of Willie Brown likability to him on a good day. And but the downside is it could skew too much to the bully. Just like Mayor Barry could be a backslapping good old boy 1 minute, or he could be a sort of corrupt, you know. And by the way, "The Bridge Set Me Up" is perhaps the perfect headline here for this episode. I mean, so my point is that you know, sometimes what makes you great can also lead to your downfall. And Christie, the bully image, reinforces a negative stereotype about him. And, you know, look, he's cultivated this image of being somebody who was, who cared more about the citizens of New Jersey than anything else, than about ideology, who didn't play partisan games like those jokers in Washington, D.C., who put people before politics. And this really has the potential to undermine all of that. I do think it's interesting, not to absolve him of the sins of his administration, but I do think it's interesting to contemplate what kind of culture created this. So even if you buy the notion that Christie didn't order this and maybe didn't even know about it, is this, you know, a result of his sort of a tacit leadership style that his team just sort of knew this is the kind of politics he wanted? Is this a New Jersey thing? I mean, is it possible to be a Boy Scout and get elected and survive governor of New Jersey? Like, don't you have to be a street brawler and play some hardball politics? And or is this an example of freelancing? Of, you know, I've derided political operatives many a time for their you know, sins. And is this an example of sort of political operatives run amok, people who like want to be little Lee Atwaters, who are power hungry and are acting unilaterally? It's not the big topic, but I think it is an interesting thing to contemplate.
Well, I think that gets into a topic that I've been kind of mulling on lately. I mean, there's plenty of examples, you know, both at the operative level and at the politician level, of people doing underhanded things who are praised for it. You know, the Gore, one of the Gore campaign managers, Michael Hooley, built a reputation of ruthlessness for allegedly engineering a traffic jam on the New Hampshire primary day, where the Bradley voters were apparently were getting blocked on the way to the polls coming back from work in Boston. You know, he wasn't drummed out of the profession. He was. I believe he insisted he was kidding. But I think there's some support that still backs it up. You know, Karl Rove had his entire career was based on that. He had the mark of Rove, and he did all these underhanded things all the time, and that showed how brilliant he was. And at the politician level, you know, people are always riding Obama that he's not LBJ enough, that he's not politically intimidating congresspeople enough, he's not threatening to take away their highway funding or other public works projects enough.
I think you make a good point, but we glamorize this stuff. And I mean, if you've read Bad Boy: The Life and Politics of Lee Atwater, or it's called Bad Boy. That tells you all you need to know. And you know, The Path to Power, the Caro book about LBJ. Ed Rollins, his book, Bare Knuckles in Back Rooms, Carville and Magala. There is a certain romance that we attach to dirty politics and the people who get away with it. And
the getting away with it, I think, is key.
Well, I do think, though, that and I don't know if this is what happened here, but I do know that it is very tempting that young up-and-coming political operatives, when they look to, you know, to try to, like, find their heroes, you know, it could be seductive or tempting to try to be like them. Like, they're renegade rebels who, like, play by their own rules, and they're celebrated for stretching the truth and bending the law or whatever. I'm not saying that's what happened here, but it is, like, an interesting subculture.
But yeah, and I think, you know, part of it is if you're not caught, if you actually got away with it, then you kind of boast about it after the fact, or it leaks out after the fact.
Yeah.
Those people get praised more than those who are caught in the act. These guys,
right.
They got called on it right away because the folks in Fort Lee and the Port Authority were like, we didn't authorize this. What's going on here? So
right.
It was a pretty inelegant payback. And also, I think another part of it is when you talk about things like LBJ style intimidation. Is it to your end? If it is ruthlessness to get the policy you want, you are far more accepting of it than if it's John Boehner handing out tobacco industry checks on the floor. You don't like what the bill was about, then you're gonna wag your finger at that.
Right.
So and in this case, it's such. It's not about winning an election itself, which is Gore v. Bradley. I'm just trying to win the election here anyway. How? This is even more depraved than that. It's because Christie was going to win. It's like Nixon and Watergate. You're going to win anyway.
Right.
But it's how much can you run up the score and position yourself for 2016? You're going to go that far. You're going to screw up people's lives and their afternoon commutes and risk people's safety in some cases, which is being talked about a bit to that end, and that seems like an extra level of wrong. Yeah,
it was like someone who would tell a lie when the truth would suffice. I do think, going back to the sort of New Jersey Sopranos mafia analogy. I think one of the reasons this is really harmful politically is that, and if you watch The Godfather, and I've talked about it here a few times, I know, not quite as much as the NFL. By the way, the playoffs are coming up. Check out my latest podcast. I interview Travis Waldron from Think Progress. Well, I don't interview. He and I, on my latest Matt Lewis and the News podcast, will predict the winners of this weekend's NFL games. But anyway, back to The Godfather. That there used to be this sort of honor among thieves, at least in fictionally, and I suspect it was real, where they wouldn't target civilians. So when Michael Corleone first becomes part of the family business, they're not too worried about protecting him because he's seen as a civilian. And I think that's part of the problem. If Christie had targeted somehow punishing a political enemy, hurting that political enemy some way, that would be one thing. But this targeted civilians, regular folks sitting in god-awful traffic, robbing them of their time with their families, their time with their jobs. And so I think that made it especially harmful politically.
Outside of the big scandal of the week, you had an interesting post about there was a National Review story suggesting that Rachel Maddow kind of rules the roost at MSNBC and that she has a hand in the editorial decisions and the programming decisions, and she's the power behind the throne. And I know MSNBC pushed back on that and said that was inaccurate. But it's obviously the case that she is the number one star of the network, and I think they have based a lot of editorial decisions around her brand and her style. Whether or not is that her doing or not, to me, is sort of not interesting. I guess there was kind of a negative slant down the National Review article that perhaps Rachel is an ideologue and not a TV programmer, and that's why they're having a ratings problem right now, and they can't exercise adult supervision. That was kind of a theme of the National Review piece. You had a different take on it, where you said maybe the right needs some Rachel Maddows. Maybe the right needs to start building up an army of younger wonkish types, and not just I don't want to put words in your mouth here, but the Fox News style is much more tabloidy. And not as policy oriented, and it also skews very old. They haven't really put a lot of effort into bringing on younger, up and coming, policy oriented voices on the network. and that certainly works as far as their overall ratings are concerned. It's not as strong for Fox as far as their 25 to 54 demographic is concerned, because they're fairly on par with CNN and MSNBC in that level. But is your nudging Fox and other conservative media in that direction ratings oriented, or is it conservative movement building oriented?
No, I mean, look, I think that there are like pros and cons to different strategies, and I suspect that in the future you're going to have a situation where more people are watching things streaming. So having 3 cable news networks, well, they will have to compete with The Blaze and the HuffPost live streaming or whatever. So this doesn't mean that necessarily Fox has to change their business model. They've been very successful. And you could argue they're changing the culture. But I guess my point that I'm making is that it's easy to sort of mock MSNBC for their ratings, but let's look at something that they are doing that conservatives by and large are not. And that is giving a platform and helping to season young, up-and-coming liberal thought leaders and wonks. Ezra Klein used to be a blogger, a liberal blogger. I used to go up against him on MSNBC. And now Ezra Klein is at the Washington Post and is on MSNBC all the time.
They'll probably not for much longer at the Washington Post.
Yeah, we'll see. Check out my podcast with Ben Dominic, where we discuss 6 months ago why Ezra Klein should possibly go out on his own. We were ahead of the curve on that one. But my point there is that Ezra Klein is obviously talented, but is he more talented than any of the many smart conservative young writers I know of my generation and even younger? Why doesn't Tim Carney or Philip Klein or a myriad of other, any number of other sort of young to middle-aged conservative thinkers, they're sort of relegated to the print/online writing world. So I don't think that the right is sort of developing the young wonks to the degree that the left is, and promoting them, giving them an audience, giving them a platform, helping to season them. And I suspect that 20 years from now, if the mainstream media and the establishment media still matter, and you could argue that they won't, but assuming there still is such a thing, then you could certainly argue that the left is doing a much better job of creating tomorrow's opinion leaders. I mean, why doesn't Ross Douthat? I mean, here's an example of a guy who actually, the rare example of a guy who actually is in a mainstream outlet. He's at the New York Times. But why doesn't he have his own TV show? I don't know if he would want it, but maybe he would. And I guess my point is I do think that, the left may be doing a lot of things wrong when it comes to getting ratings, but I think the one thing that they're doing probably a better job of is creating tomorrow's opinion leaders who kind of have the gravitas and are up on that perch. And I think that might be something that conservatives will lament down the road.
I mean, possibly. I mean, I imagine one of these days, your generation of conservative journalists and pundits will have their day. I mean, I would think that within Washington media circles, people are aware of what you and Tim Carney and Con Carroll and Douthat and others are doing. What you're a bit hamstrung in that Fox is the 500-pound gorilla of cable talk, and they have good ratings, although they do skew old. It's clearly a profitable network as it is, and therefore they have not had a lot of reason to change what they're doing. I mean, they've had a fairly stable lineup for a very long time.
Right. But you make that's totally true. I would say that, and this sort of goes back to my original statement, that it's, their hosts tend to be different people that I don't know or really interact with, like former talk show hosts, former political candidates, or broadcasters from small markets. Whereas MSNBC, I mean, I used to work with Alex Wagner at Politics Daily. I know, Chris Hayes. These are like people that are sort of young, progressive writers who would essentially be like the liberal version of, Tim Carney, or Ben Dominic, or whatever. And so I rarely, I think that it is quite different, the types of people that are getting the shows and the contracts on the right and the left. Now, this could totally change, because I do expect there to be a proliferation of, Dana Lash. You got to see the trailer that they did for her at the Blaze. She has a new show. It's very professional looking. It looks like a great show. I haven't seen it yet, just the trailer. But you could imagine a world where people aren't really sitting on their couches and turning on their cable TV. They're going to their Apple TV, and they're sort of watching things a la carte. And they'll watch this MSNBC show, and then this Fox show, and then this Huffington Post show, and then this Blaze show. And so the paradigm could totally change, and this may be a moot point. But it also may not be. And if down the road, the Chris Hayeses of the world are elevated, and the Philip Kleins of the world are not, that could have consequences.
Well, I think, even though there's going to be more a la carte stuff, more and more in the future, there's always going to be networks. There's always going to be some appetite to watch something that other people are watching, in a sense that this is an influential show that the insiders are tuned into. I think there's always going to be room for that. And I think, MSNBC has a lot of younger people on these days, because, they've basically been experimenting for over a decade, because they've always been the scrappy number 3 cable news network, and they keep trying new things. And now they've kind of hit upon something that, even if it's not catapulted them into first place across the board, it's given them a fan base that's pretty loyal.
Yeah. You're right about the experiment. People forget, it wasn't that long ago, in the grand scheme of things, that Laura Ingraham and Michael Savage and Alan Keyes and, of course, Tucker Carlson and many others had their own shows on MSNBC.
Right.
So who knows if this model is going to last either.
True. I think they're constantly you constantly reassess until you're in first, and Fox been first for a long time, and so that can make you a little stodgy. And their big new hire recently was George Will, who appeals to, I think, people who are over 55 and who are the bulk of the Fox News audience. And that's not to say that they're not human beings who shouldn't get to watch people they want to watch.
And me. Let's be honest, and me. I love watching the Special Report. I love Krautheimer and Will. But I do realize I skew a little older. For some reason, a lot of the shows I watch have, commercials for Depends. And so that may say something about my viewing habits. If you watch Andy Griffith reruns, you're going to get that. So, but you're probably right. Me and a lot of grandmas, I guess.
But at some point that ages out. At some point, Fox has to have a bit of a day of reckoning, and have a generational shift in who they put on. And if I was at Fox, I would want to do that in more of a.
I apologize for interrupting, but
sure.
It's not just generational. The Five, which gets pretty good ratings, skews pretty young. It's Dana Perina and Greg Gutfield and others, and they're fairly young. These are people probably in their 40s.
No, not wonkish. It doesn't hit your wonkish sweet spot.
Andrea Tantaros is young, very she's quite young. But it's different. They're not. It's not the analog to Alex Wagner, Chris Hayes, Melissa Harris Perry, at all.
And I think MSNBC is trying to do that wonk thing in a TV-friendly way. I don't think they're trying to be completely... I mean, they're not NPR. They're not. It's not PBS NewsHour. It's still trying to be very punchy, and they've gotten in trouble. It's not being too punchy. So they're trying to walk that line. And Fox doesn't seem... they have a... I think a lower brow view of what works politically and what works on television. And I don't think that is inducing them to scoop up some of the sharper talent that is, on the right. And I just think it would make more sense to them to gradually work some of that in. They don't have to have a wholesale shift. They don't have to fire the entire primetime lineup. But you might want to bring more and more folks in, give them more pundit slots, try out a different kind of show on the weekend. It's not like a Mike Huckabee, kind of talk show. So that's more firing line, and see how that goes. I mean, they did try that Daily Show knockoff a couple of years back, which was a total bust. So they're not completely averse to all sorts of experimentation. But I think it's a lot less so than what MSNBC has done.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I mean, necessity is the mother of invention, and if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And so MSNBC has arrived at where they are now, sort of by virtue of having nothing to lose. And all I'm saying is that that there may be unintended consequences, and it may be that we look back down the road and say, well, MSNBC wasn't able to compete in terms of ratings, but wow, one thing they really did was, 5 of the top, sort of thought leaders, were from that crop that they started developing in 2012 or whatever. I mean, I know this is sort of me, nitpicking, but that's what I do. That's what I do. As a writer, you look, I mean, what am I to say? Everything's great. Conservatives should just rest on their laurels. They're kicking ass. I mean, what good would that be? I think you have to look at, respect the other side and what might they be doing and just because you're on top today doesn't mean it's going to always last. Things change.
Now, you had a piece in this week that got a lot of attention on at least on the right, I feel, where you suggested that conservatives are getting too infatuated with monarchies, which I think is a roiling topic that the left is not aware was even going on. We didn't know there was a pro-monarchy faction of the right, but maybe you should illuminate us what the debate is right now.
Well, so I would push back on the notion that I suggest that this is like a huge thing on the right, because I mean, headlines aside, which I don't write, I go to great pains to say that this is a small fraction of the right. Having said that, it does seem to be a little bit of a trend, and I cite different examples. So, for example, at Politico magazine, Michael Oslin, I think I'm pronouncing it right, who's a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, had a piece that he probably didn't title himself called "America Needs a King," where he essentially argues that the job of the president is too big for any one man, and we should have like a sort of Queen of England type. This person could serve, it's not like a hereditary thing, but this person would essentially do all the symbolic duties. Now, where I think I upset him and others is by tying this in with some other trends that are happening. There are other people who, other conservatives who are like quite literally saying that democracy has failed. And in fact, Peter, is it Thiel? I don't know how it's pronounced.
That's the executive at PayPal?
Yeah, the co-founder of PayPal in 2009 wrote, "I no longer believe that freedom and democracy are compatible." And that's kind of indicative of this trend of some kind of libertarian conservative techno bloggers. It's really a subculture out there. I'm not arguing that it's a majority, but it is out there, and there are people on the right who believe that monarchy is better than democracy, and that democracy has failed. And so this is something that I wrote about. I think it's interesting. I think that it is on the rise, and I think it's because this happens during times when people are starting to give up on democracy. When the economy's bad, you have a leader that people perceive as weak. So I think that's one of the reasons to explain it. I think there's also a sense that conservatism has failed at sort of stopping liberalism and the trend toward liberalism. But the controversy, I think, comes from people who frankly didn't really read my piece.
Because Jonah Goldberg was very uppity about it.
Right. I'm supposed to, we'll see if it happens. I know he's a busy guy. I'm supposed to debate Jonah later on a podcast today about this. He wrote a piece at the National Review on The Corner titled, "What Country is Matt Lewis Looking At?" It appears to be basically a defense of his colleague, the scholar at AEI. But many of the points that he makes were specifically addressed in my piece. So, for example, he'll say, as part of this larger trend, I talk about Pat Buchanan's, sort of recent piece talking about how great Vladimir Putin is. Is Putin one of us? Was what Pat Buchanan asked. Is he a paleocon? And I wrote about that as being sort of probably part of this larger trend where more and more, people on the right are essentially looking to somebody who can symbolically bring us together as a strong man, and of course who's more culturally conservative than Obama. This is probably a result of people thinking Obama's weak. But I really went to great pains to say there's really no moral equivalency between what the AEI guy is calling for and what Buchanan's calling for, and that this is a very disparate thing. And yet, in debunking my piece, Jonah says, Putin's not even a monarch. A fact that I went to great pains to make.
He's democratically elected, right?
Yeah. This is it is interesting. I think there's a thing where people think that I'm writing this that it's concern trolling, and that I'm writing this to make the right look bad or to make conservatives look bad. That's not why I'm doing it. I've written plenty of pieces talking about the left's autocratic tendencies. You and I have discussed it here. You've pushed back on it when I talked about liberals who thought Stalin was great and that Soviet Union was great. And now I'm looking at the other side. The right. There are fringe elements of the right who have these, and it's existed in the Catholic and sort of fringe Catholic edges of Catholicism for a long time. And I'm, as a writer, exploring that and sort of turning people on to some of these trends. I'm not arguing that it's sweeping the nation and that it's going to take over conservatism, but it's really out there, and I think it's interesting to discuss.
Well, I think there's always strains on either side who aren't getting what they want through democracy, because you can always get what you want through any political system. And so if they're not getting what they want through democracy, they then fantasize or romanticize what's being gotten in some other non-democratic society. If Pat Buchanan say I get to hate gays in Putin's Russia, maybe that's where I should be. Right. That's not working out through democracy. There was more of that kind of talk, after the Great Depression, because there was an understandable sense that, wow, this really didn't work. This is a total breakdown here of the economy. Maybe capitalism doesn't work. Maybe democracy doesn't work. Maybe we have to do something radically different just to sustain as a people, which was wrong. It wasn't true that you couldn't make capitalism and democracy work. You had to make some adjustments.
Well, there is a logic to this, by the way. When you talk about this sort of there's so many words, anarchist, techno-libertarian, sort of monarchist movement on the right, they actually have some rational arguments. I'm not saying good arguments, but there's a certain logic to their argument. Now, again, I want to make a big distinction between this and what the AEI scholar was advocating. But they basically argue that, look, if you have a king, you at least know that the king is trying to screw you. So, now if this is like an all-powerful dictator, there's not much you can do about it. But if it's, Great Britain or, something at a certain point in history, you know that they're the bad guy. But if you have a democracy, then you have a situation where I may want to raise taxes because the transfer of wealth is going to go to me. So, you'd have to read my piece. I'm more eloquent in it, like literally quoting them to understand their logic. But they do have an argument for why they believe that monarchy would be preferable. At the end of my piece, I quote John. I want to make sure I say it right. Zimrak, who's the author of a book called The Bad Catholic's Guide to the Catechism, and he says, "You conserve what's best in your own tradition. You don't indulge in utopian fantasies of replacing it with something alien and untried." And so he was essentially there talking about that, if you're in Europe, then hearkening back to monarchy, if you're a conservative, may make a certain amount of sense. It is weird when American conservatives do it, is I think what he would say.
I mean, is it that hard to envision winning the next election and getting more of your way the next time? No one was making these arguments in the 8 years of Bush, from what I can recall.
Yeah. Well, these folks have larger philosophical arguments than just about who's going to win the next election. But I would say that I think this tendency has something to do with, again, losing elections, seeing a sense that democracy, that Republicans, that we've arrived at a point in democracy where people are voting their own self-interest, which is to say they're voting their own pocketbook, which is to say they are voting for the transfer of funds. So when enough people, when the majority of the voters are receiving, welfare or some sort of benefits from the government, then their vote is compromised. And the argument would be we've arrived at that point where that's what's happening, and so Republicans can't win, and conservatives essentially have proven that they cannot stop. All they can do is slow the march toward liberalism. They can't stop it.
But any government structure involves the allocation of resources. That's just an unavoidable reality of governance. I mean, if you're not interested in organizing and allocating your resources, then you have an anarchy. I mean, a monarch is going to allocate resources in some way. It's not just to leave everything to chance. If you want to leave everything to chance, then you have no governing structure at all. I mean, you could believe that, of course, but to think that I'm going to think of some other governing structure where I get to keep all of what I get and I don't have to give it to anybody else anytime, then you're not talking about a governance structure anymore. You're talking about a Wild West situation.
Well, I really want to challenge anybody who's interested in this, because I don't know that I've done it justice discussing it. This is a really sort of abstract topic, and I went to great pains to write it very precisely and to do a lot of research into this. And so if you're interested in this, please read it before commenting. And it's titled, "Why Are U.S. Conservatives So Obsessed with Monarchies?" It was at The Week. And it's I don't know, it's like 1,500 words or something. It's longer than a lot of my columns. Maybe it's 1,000. But it's a really interesting phenomenon. Again, I think that people took it as an example of me tearing down the right, or of me implying that this is like pervasive. But I don't think either of those things, but I do think it's legit, and that it deserves to be discussed, and it had not gotten that much attention.
Speaking of things that got no attention, I also have a piece up at The Week in response to the kerfuffle over the Bob Gates memoir called Cabinet Officials Going Rogue, A Brief History, and just showing how it is far from unusual for a cabinet secretary to take some pot shots after leaving his post. And what Gates has done really pales in comparison to what has happened in the past. But I think the political world is so obsessed with Chris Christie that my brilliant thoughts have been overlooked for the time. So for the few of you out there that are interested, just know that's up at theweek.com also.
Yeah, nothing was going to get any traction. I wonder, you have to guess that Barack Obama was very happy that the Gates stuff was overshadowed. But I suspect it hurt Gates, and they were attempting to get publicity and buzz out of the book. I mean, who knows if they put the most salacious stuff out there first? But if they did, I have to imagine this cost them a lot of money in publicity.
I mean, it's kind of you can't control. I know the guy who wrote the Roger Ailes book is having to deal with the same issues too. He got some pre-publicity from the New York Times. They bumped up the release stakes. They thought it was generating a lot of buzz, and now maybe they're not so sure. I don't know. But I know Gates is on the Today Show Monday, and he's on Morning Joe on Wednesday. I know MSNBC has been hyping that. For those who think MSNBC is always in Obama's pocket, they are actively promoting the Bob Gates book, so that doesn't seem to be the case here. And I don't know what other media he's got planned, but I'm sure he's going to hit the circuit. So we'll find out if he's got other stuff in the book. My sense of the book, from what little we know, is that it's a mix of praise and criticism. It's not just a bunch of cheap shots, and not to mention it's one person's perspective. It's not the final history of the Obama administration. There's going to be several accounts that come out over time, and they're always going to match up, and that's what historians do, is to line them all up and try to make sense of it all.
I think a couple things though. The fact that he was so highly regarded as a serious, thoughtful guy, and not the kind of this isn't like Scott, what's his name, the deputy Bush press secretary who went after Bush. I mean, this is a guy who was a high-ranking cabinet official who had served in bipartisan capacity in different administrations. Everybody thought he was sort of low-key and really not the kind of person who would write this kind of a book. I think people were stunned that it came from him. Scott McKinnon was the name I was referencing.
But it's a serious book, I'm sure. I'm not saying it should be dismissed completely, but it's still just one guy's view of it. I mean, for example, he's complaining about how Obama had conversations about military matters when he wasn't in the room. Well, that happens. Presidents get to talk to whoever they want to talk about. It doesn't mean he didn't talk to you at all. So he just might have because he's so protective of his turf, he might have a more negative take on that than maybe an historian would when he looks at all the conversations the president had. What was the final policy decision that was made after all of his conversations? What factors came into play? And how did the policy work out over time, which you can't assess yet because you're still in the middle of everything. So I just don't. You can't look at this book and say this is the Rosetta Stone of the Obama presidency. It can't be that. It's from one vantage point of the presidency. It should be read. I'm sure it's going to be important in assessing the presidency when it's all said and done. But to say Gates said X, therefore X is the only perspective to have on, I just don't think is going to be borne out at the end of the day.
All right, correction. Scott McClellan. Scott McClellan.
How soon we forget.
Yes, I apologize for that. I don't like getting names wrong. It's like the kind of thing where if you're writing about him, you obviously look the name up. If you're on TV, you just shut up and don't mention the person's name. If you're on the DMZ, you sort of let it go and you take a shot. Scott McClellan. Yeah, look, I agree that you shouldn't read too much into what any one person, even if it's an important person, says, because they're different perspectives. Having said that, there have been plenty of examples. I mean, Scott McClellan would be one, I would think. Even Woodward books that dominate the political, the media, entire media cycles for days, obsessing on what one person thinks. And that didn't happen here because the Chris Christie bridge story stepped on it. So I think that helps Obama. Now, granted, that we are not talking about the war on poverty, and we are not talking about income inequality, which is what Obama wants to be talking about. But at least we're not talking about this Gates book either. We're talking about a Republican scandal. So I think it's probably a win for Obama.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think he's happy that we're not consumed by questions of the president's leadership capabilities and does he inject too much politics into his foreign policy decisions. I'm sure he's happy not to be on the defense about that. But we've had situations, as I get into my piece. I mean, Reagan got completely blasted. David Stockman's Triumph of Politics, which made a mockery of his budgeting process. But that came out the same year as he had his biggest tax reform bill pass. Donald Reagan, came out and slammed the White House, slammed Nancy Reagan for following astrologers. Doesn't mean that affected how he handled Gorbachev and navigating Glasnost. And you have even harsher situations where FDR's budget director, Lewis Douglas, resigned in protest over his spending and then started giving speeches calling the New Deal a parallel to communism and endorsed Republican candidates for president. FDR managed to overcome that. William Jennings Bryan bolted from Wilson's administration over his handling of Germany before World War I, before he entered it. And Bryan was like the king of the Democratic Party at that point. There was a risk that was going to split the party in two. But Wilson got out on the stump and made his case for military preparedness, and it worked out all right for him. So, for Gates to come out with like a mix of praise and criticism, even saying apparently that Obama was right in the end of it in his decision making, that's pretty small bore stuff compared to what other presidents have had to deal with and have overcome.
Yeah, it wasn't Stephanopoulos' book All Too Human. I don't think the Clinton people were terribly happy with that for some reason.
Well, you're never happy with these things. It's always unpleasant to have to go through, but that's part of.
But most of these things existed. In fairness, I mean, most of these examples you cited were before the kind of 24-hour news media, which means that even though they were obsessed over, they not to the degree that they are now. And in the grand scheme of things, they may not matter that much. But if you care about winning news cycles, if you care about... And I think Obama was really trying to get back on message. You had the 50th anniversary of LBJ's War on Poverty. You have the debate over whether or not to raise minimum wage, over extending unemployment insurance. So you had these things happening, and I think that the danger for Obama is that he doesn't get to talk, that another year goes by where he's talking about things other than income inequality.
I mean, I think he's gotten pretty used to the fact that he doesn't get to control the news cycles on a day-to-day basis all the time. When you're president, you are buffeted by events a whole lot more than you would wish to be. And I think he knows that you have to just kind of, scratch and claw your way through that, all the time. And there's plenty of things that he's been counted out on, that he has managed to scratch and claw his way through despite these headwinds. So I'm sure he's not delighted about it. I'm also thinking of all the things that have been thrown at him over the course of the past 5 years. I imagine he's not too flummoxed.
Well, you may be right. We'll see how things go. It's going to be an interesting week. What happens with Christie, especially. So I don't know if you have any. Go check. Check out that piece. Check out Bill's piece in the week where he talks about Gates. Check out my piece on monarchy. Check out my podcast, Matt Lewis in the News. with Travis Waldron of Think Progress, where we discuss make our NFL picks. And Bill, I don't know if you have any Aussie Rules football picks this week.
Well, it's off season now.
Well, of course. You got the Patriots in the playoffs. I assume your team up there, right?
I was born in New York.
Are you more of a Giants fan or a Jets fan?
I never pick sides in New York. I never was loyal to a borough or a region.
Well, either way, you're out of the playoffs, so it doesn't matter. So.
But everyone's very excited here in Patriots country. But I'm not overly focused.
Well, if you're not watching the game, you can check us out, of course, at your convenience, and you can comment here. But if you want to make sure that we see it as well, go to Facebook, DMZ Show, and that's our page. You can chime in there. Also on Twitter at DMZ Show. Thanks for watching us for yet another week, and thank you, Bill, for allowing me to talk your ear off today.
Always a pleasure. I'll catch you next week.
See you, man.
Bye.